All right, welcome to Module 7. Our first subject for Week 4, this is Module 7, Week 4, is voting in elections, which are essential features of democratic governments. More broadly, this module addresses issues related to political participation, which are activities by individuals that specifically seek to influence politics and governments. Voting is just one example of political participation, which can include protesting, volunteering for public office or for public service, contacting elected officials, joining a political interest group, contributing money to candidates and causes, and organizing petitions to propose a law or change an existing law, among other things. Historically, voting has been the most common form of participation, but voting has not always been encouraged in the United States. At the founding, voting rights were reserved for white property owners. Women at the time were excluded from voting in all states in federal elections, in all states except New Jersey, which subsequently rescinded the right to vote by women in federal elections. The historic trend line for voter access has been steadily the trend has been to expand access to the ballot. The first great wave of voter enfranchisement came early in the 19th century as a wave of voting rights movement swept the states and led to pretty much universal suffrage for all white males. The election of 1828 was the first to include non-property owning white males in the electorate. The next great expansion occurred in 1870 with the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which granted the right to vote to African Americans. The language of the 15th Amendment might have been construed to include black women, but interpretations of the amendment were narrowly construed to continue to deny black women the right to vote. Women finally gained the right to vote via the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in the 1920 and constituted the single largest expansion of the franchise in American history. Virtually one half of the eligible population suddenly was given that right. The last significant expansion of the right to vote came in 1971 with ratification of the 26th Amendment, which lowered the age limit for voting in federal elections to 18, the culmination of a movement that began actually during World War II. And again, that 10 million more voters suddenly were added to the voting rolls. As I mentioned in an earlier presentation, the Constitution delegates to the states the authority to set the times, places, and qualifications for voting, but reserves to Congress the authority to alter any state regulations. So states have considerable latitude to make laws, but they can't do so in a way that violates federal election law. The history of voting rights in the United States is not entirely a narrative of expansion. Many states have persistently employed tactics designed to discriminate against segments of their population, and the targets tend to vary by region. Certainly out west, the aim has been at Hispanic voters, and in the Mountain West, it's been Native Americans. In the Southwest, it's been Hispanics. In the South, it's been primarily blacks, but also Hispanics in some states. Among the tactics used to try and suppress the vote include literacy tests, which required proof of English proficiency, but were consistently employed in ways to deny blacks and immigrants the right to vote. Property requirements, as I noted, along with the requirement of proof that a person was a tax-paying citizen, that was employed again in many southern states to disfranchise poor black and white sharecroppers, the latter of which were increasingly viewed with hostility by rich white southern planters because of their embrace of populist causes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Grandfather clauses, I mentioned in an earlier presentation, grandfather clauses essentially hold that if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you were ineligible as well, which excluded, again, both blacks whose grandfathers were enslaved and immigrants whose grandfathers weren't U.S. citizens. You had in the South, again, all white primaries. Again, political parties are considered private organizations, and the South was basically dominated by Democrats for many decades. The Democratic Party basically barred blacks from voting in its primary. And since the election effectively took place within the primary, because Republicans really had no realistic chance of winning back then, that basically meant again that blacks had no say. And finally, you had poll taxes, which again was a fee that you would require to register a person to vote. And that again hit low-income Americans, including blacks, other minorities, and the poor generally. Poll taxes were often due at times before sharecroppers were able to get their crops harvested and sold, so they didn't have the money. Finally, when those discriminatory tactics failed, whites frequently resorted to lynching minorities who attempted to exercise their right to vote. In one infamous incident, Maceo Snipes, a black World War II veteran, was shot to death on his porch in Butler, Georgia in 1946. In connecting voting and elections to our previous discussion of the civil rights movement, we should note that the civil rights movement succeeded in influencing Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which resulted in dramatically increased voter registration of blacks and members of other minority groups, and greatly increased participation by blacks and members of other minority groups, and increased the number of women, blacks, Hispanics, and other members of other minority groups in considering running for public office. The advances in recent voter access have contracted somewhat in recent years. For example, in Crawford versus Marion County Election Board in 2008, the Supreme Court held that Indiana's strict voter ID law was constitutional. Some have argued that voter IDs have had, voter ID laws have had no measurable impact on voter turnout, that while voter ID laws may be intended to reduce the turnout of certain groups of Americans, counter mobilizations tend to wash those things out. Some studies, though, have produced evidence that strict voter ID laws may reduce voter turnout by up to 2%, which is significant when you're talking about elections that are generally, decided on the margins. Studies have also shown that strict voter ID laws had no effect on detecting or deterring voter fraud, which is, the main reason why people, claim that they're putting those laws into effect. Likewise, in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down a critical section of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which required the Justice Department approval for any changes in election laws that were being contemplated by states and or precincts that had a previous history of voter discrimination. According to the Brenner Center for Justice, by striking down this what is known as pre-clearance requirement in Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court opened the door for states with a history of voter discrimination to reimpose discriminatory voting regulations. Unsurprisingly, 23 states have subsequently passed laws that appear calculated to reduce voter turnout among minority groups, including strict voter ID laws, purges of voter registration lists, which require if your name gets kicked off the list, you have to re-register by a certain date, or you lose the right to vote in upcoming elections. And then there also have been restrictions on early voting and voting by mail, among other measures. One of the reasons American elections are generally viewed as both free and fair is that our election system is highly decentralized and nearly impossible to kind of rig from above, as Donald Trump could probably attest. It's very difficult to do because, again, you've got people who are managing elections at the local level who basically are just following the law. Each of the 50 states have their own rules for conducting elections, and counties in each state have election boards that oftentimes have a great deal of latitude in terms of setting conditions on how votes can be conducted. As I mentioned earlier, the federal government has the authority to pass laws concerning some aspects of the voting process. The last significant voting rights legislation was the National Voter Registration Act in 1993, which was also called the Motor Voter Bill, which basically meant that divisions of motor vehicles could actually get people registered to vote. And that, again, it made it easier for people to get access to, to voter registration materials. And, frankly, it significantly improved voter registration, but not necessarily voter turnout. One of the biggest problems surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic was how to safely conduct elections during a serious outbreak of a deadly disease. Many states expanded voter access, to vote by mail, to absentee ballot, and again, that actually served to significantly expand voter turnout in the 2020 elections. One issue related to voting rights is the question of felon voting. Uh, right now, only felons in Maine, Vermont, and the District of Columbia retain the right to vote while serving a prison sentence. In 8 states, you can permanently lose the right to vote as a result of a federal felony conviction. And in 15 states, your right to vote is returned to you once you successfully complete your prison sentence and any post-incarceration penalties like parole or fines have been served or paid. In 20 states, your right to vote is returned after your prison sentence without reference to probation. In Florida, again, this is a state, it's a very large population state that has a very large felon population. Citizens placed an initiative on the ballot to end the state's permanent revocation of felons' right to vote. In 2018, nearly 65% of Florida voters supported Florida Amendment 4, which returned voter eligibility to nearly 1.4 million Floridians, Floridian felons. Then the Florida legislature got to work and it passed a law that effectively reversed the will of the people of Florida voters by passing a law requiring that felons must pay all fines and fees associated with their convictions prior to applying to have their voting rights returned. And frankly, the decentralized and unorganized nature of Florida's criminal record keeping meant that felons oftentimes were unaware that they owed any money. And in many instances, again, because if you've been incarcerated for a period of time, you may not have any money, which means you aren't capable of paying fines or fees, which, and again, the administrative fees in Florida are abnormally high. So when we think about these things, political parties have 2 pathways to electoral victory. On the one hand, they can appeal to voters in hopes of maximizing turnout of voters who support their candidates. And on the other hand, they can engage in the attempt to engage in targeted voter suppression, suppressing the votes of the other party while attempting to maximize the votes of their party. Voter suppression can take several forms. Strict voter ID laws, as I noted above, can generally lead to up to a 2% drop in turnout. Low-income Americans, the elderly, and minorities are the ones that typically don't possess a driver's license or some other kind of, voter, a picture-related identification. And so are most likely to be disfranchised by strict voter ID laws. In some states, like Texas, you can have a fishing license and that will be okay. But you can't use, for example, a university ID card. The argument there would be that a lot of students are maybe foreigners and may not, they may be foreign born and not U.S. citizens, and therefore can't register. I don't think that's hard to fix. You could actually pass legislation mandating that universities designate whether a student, is a voting citizen or not. In some states, rules are passed that limit early voting or mandate strict poll closures on election day. Again, that disproportionately suppresses the vote of low-income voters who often live in areas that have very few polling places, and that often results in very long lines on election day. As I noted a little while ago, voter purges, where election officials purge from registration lists anyone who hasn't voted in the recent past, and you may vary, from 2 election cycles to 8 years or something like that, requiring the purged voters to re-register, and if they weren't aware that their registration had been purged, then again they would lose their right to vote in that election. Another important issue related to voting and elections is gerrymandering, which refers to drawing district boundaries in a way that confer an advantage for one party's candidates. The text describes 2 forms of partisan gerrymandering: partisan gerrymanders, which work to the advantage of either Democrats or Republicans, and racial gerrymandering, where district lines, again, deliberately attempt to dilute the voting strength of blacks or other minorities. Racial gerrymanders have been ruled unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court in Rucho versus Common Cause in 2019 held that partisan gerrymanders were non-justiciable, meaning that the court could not adjudicate those conflicts because they were considered political questions. I think that decision was wrong, and it has opened the door on both sides to some really hardball gerrymandering, which is much more scientifically based. They can do it a lot more accurately these days. And it frankly does, I think, contribute to lower turnout, because if you're in a gerrymandered district and you're a member of the minority party in that district, you don't see the point. You think the rules are stacked against you, because they are. So the consequences of gerrymandering are significant. Voters of the minority party are less likely to vote where gerrymanders are particularly strong. The challenge for parties determined to gerrymander is that over time, voter preferences may change. For example, here in Oklahoma, Democrats attempted to gerrymander federal districts in 1990 to preserve their advantages, but over the course of 2 election cycles, had basically lost all 6 seats in the House of Representatives. In fact, up until 2018, Republicans had dominated the federal seats in the House of Representatives. Republicans had controlled all the seats. Likewise, Texas severely gerrymandered in 2010, but found demographic changes had opened up a number of seats that were previously safe in GOP suburbs around Houston and Dallas, Fort Worth area. And so, again, the challenge is, and one thing that I think Republicans found themselves doing because their gerrymanders were so good in 2010, was that they were really looking more to shore up their existing advantages rather than expand them. I want to close this presentation by briefly discussing policies designed to increase voter access to the vote. Several states have expanded registration opportunities and increased the number of days for early voting. Several states have made it easier for convicted felons to regain the right to vote. Additionally, 5 states, Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington, vote entirely by mail now. Importantly, again, there's no evidence that vote by mail results in greater instances of voter fraud. Other examples of policies that tend to expand voter turnout include online voter registration, automatic voter registration when a resident reaches the age of 18 with an opt-out option, same-day voter registration, allowing generous periods for early voting, and expanding access to absentee ballots. I hope this presentation helps you understand how voting and elections work in the United States. There's a lot more, of course, in this chapter. If you have any questions related to this presentation or the assigned reading, please don't hesitate to ask a question on the weekly discussion board. See you next time.